I was a university student at State University of New York at Buffalo, and there was the first time I actually saw Prabhupada was, I saw an interview when Prabhupada was being, not Prabhupada, but I think it was Ray Rama, was being interviewed on some television program, or perhaps it was Hayagriva. And he said he was walking down the street and he met a Swami and he described him with his pointed shoes or whatever like that. And I thought, why doesn't something like that ever happen to me? And then very soon after that, I saw the devotees I thought it was the Les Crane show, but then I found out, according to what Sambasundar Prabhu said in his memories, that it wasn't, it was some other interviewer. And I saw the devotees and it was so attractive, and I remembered some of the things that Prabhupada had said, and I thought was funny. He said, the interviewer asked him how old he was, and Prabhupada said 70 years old, and just so naturally he said, and I still have all my teeth. And he just smiled in such a way, in such a relaxed way. And it was, and they asked him, are you liberated? And Prabhupada said, yes, and so are all my disciples. It was just so captivating. And then soon after that, there was a university class at the university, State University of Buffalo, on meditation. And I chanted Hare Krishna there when Rupanuga Prabhu was the person who was leading that class, and I wasn't so impressed with the philosophy at that particular point, but he said, you chant Hare Krishna. So I started chanting Hare Krishna, and then by the time the next class came around, I was thinking of myself as a devotee because the Mahamantra was so powerful. That was clear to me. So in any case, then when Prabhupada came back from Los Angeles, came back from his trip to India after his heart attack, he came to, after going to Los Angeles and perhaps San Francisco, he went to 26 2nd Avenue, and Rupanuga sent me, and this was in the middle of the winter, to see Prabhupada with another student. And we hitchhiked from State University of New York in Buffalo, upstate New York, to 26 2nd Avenue to New York City, and then we arrived there and took a train across town, and we arrived just when Prabhupada was beginning his class. So we walked into a room that was full of souls who were listening to Prabhupada, and my first had a few reactions, because one was that I had been listening to the Happening album over and over and over again, just turning it over and turning it over and turning it over, because I used to collect records, as so many of us did in those days, and Rupanuga had said, if you like listening to records, you can listen to Hare Krishna records. So I said, how many are there? And he said, 1. So somehow or another, I was satisfied just turning it over and turning it over and turning it over and listening to Prabhupada's words. So by the time I saw Prabhupada, I could understand his accent quite well. And my first reaction is he reminded me of my grandfather. He was so elderly, and then he was so powerful. I recognized that immediately. I don't remember anything specific from the lecture, but I remembered he was so powerful. I also remembered that I had this question in my mind before seeing Prabhupada, because I had a conception of what a perfect person was like. So I was wondering whether he was going to stop at a red light. It's a peculiar wonder, but when there was no traffic, does he follow all the rules like that? And then, so I saw that Prabhupada immediately There was a red light, he looked both ways and just walked across the street, and immediately understood that how practical Krishna consciousness was and how practical Prabhupada was. It was practical. He was theoretically and philosophically and spiritually fixed, but always feet on the ground and practical. He also said at that time that that he wanted to project a letter that someone had sent him. I don't remember the exact content of the letter, but he felt it very significant. So he wanted to use I guess an opaque projector to project it on the wall during that same meeting with a few people. And he said from now on, he told his servants that from now on we should always carry a projector with us. So I understood from that Prabhupada was certainly willing to use technology in the service of preaching. So I heard Prabhupada say in 26 Second Avenue, this was still in 1968. Yes, so I heard him say that two sort of handy phrases that really stuck in my mind that I found very practical. One is, if something is auspicious, do it immediately. And if something is inauspicious, put it off. So I use that all the time, still to this day, 50 years later. The other one was, something is better than nothing. So that one I forgot about. Now I'll start using it again. Something is better than nothing. It's such common sense. It's so practical that if someone can do something, it's certainly better than him doing nothing. So it's good to see the good also. That's really, now that I think about it, it's very helpful in dealing with each other. You could see the good in the person's attempt and in Krishna consciousness, especially the eternal value in something that someone has done. That reminds me of that story from 26 Second Avenue. I wasn't present there, but when the derelict in Australia, if you call him a bum, it means something quite different, but a derelict walked in to 26 Second Avenue with some toilet paper, and he said, "Here, this is for you." And then he was a dirty old fellow and reeked of alcohol, and he walked out, and Prabhupada said his spiritual life has begun. So something was certainly better than nothing. I remember one time in Melbourne, all the devotees were sitting together, and he was speaking to us in such a way that made us feel that we were all compassionate. We're doing such compassionate work, and he made us feel that we were deeply compassionate inside. But at least for myself, I was thinking, I don't have a drop of compassion in me, really. But he was speaking to that part of you that was the most sincere part of you, because he wanted that part to grow. I saw that very clearly as a teacher, and a very expert teacher. But an expert teacher he has more than one methodology in his repertoire, in his toolbox, so he knew when to use which you could say technique for the benefit of the person. Sometimes potential. Yes, because everyone did have such potential. And I'd say also in the beginning days, it was very more individualistic, his training of people. And then later on, because there were so many devotees, it wasn't and it was very few devotees had really personal contact with him, and could ask, and he didn't participate in their lives in a particularly personal way, but they only saw him when he came to the temple, and then generally only during the Bhagavatam class and the Bhagavad Gita class. But yet Prabhupada's potency was such that everyone felt that they had such a strong personal individual relationship with them. But one time in Melbourne, when only myself and Jagatrini Mataji and Tusta Krishna, that Swami, were in the room with Prabhupada, it was right after he woke up after his afternoon nap, and he walked out, he sat down, and he said, "They write me so many letters, and they say, 'Dear Prabhupada, I am the most fallen, insignificant soul, and I have a great problem, a big problem.' And then he just sort of laughed in a knowing, disappointed way, and he just said, just see. So it took me a long time to understand what was disappointing in that. And then after quite a while, I could understand that if you're an insignificant soul, and insignificant souls can't have great problems, you can only have an insignificant problem. So then Prabhupada responded to his own comment by saying that I wish I could train all my disciples personally, but what can I do? So I learned many things from that, and I think one was that I very much doubt that most of the devotees, myself included, could have handled the kind of intensity of training and with the full surrender required to be in the presence of someone like Prabhupada, never mind like Prabhupada, to be in Prabhupada's presence, because you have to be in the presence of fire, you have to be fire yourself. You have to be fired up. You have to be able to see things from his point of view. So it was Krishna's arrangement in some senses. I saw that we didn't get as much personal association as we would have loved to have had, because it took so much surrender. But I also saw that we would have really, on the other hand, benefited from that personal touch and the personal adjustment to the individuals, the personal adjustment of the training to the individual and his capacity. And I saw that with him dealing with Jagaturini, my wife, one time when he told her in Fiji that this is Prabhupada wasn't politically correct. He didn't really consider that, but he said, you should act as a maidservant of your husband. And she responded in a very clear-headed way that I wasn't trained in that way. And Prabhupada said, but if something is better, you should accept it. So and that convinced her, just by that very personal and intimate instruction, that convinced her of a point that is so culturally non-relevant and against what the world is, the direction the world is going in nowadays. But it was his personal touch that really moved her heart. Well, in Hong Kong, it was a very difficult time. We were all alone for many, many years. And some of the devotees who came and visited us, the few devotees weren't, and they weren't sometimes they were a little eccentric or something like that. And then, so it was very, very difficult for us. And Hong Kong is, I'd say, the most materialistic city. And I'm from New York, and it was more intense and materialistic than New York. And it was very difficult. I don't want to go into all the difficulties that were there, but we were struggling. And Prabhupada, when he came and visited us in Hong Kong in 1974, he was very strong. And he was very strong, and he chastised me especially. And Jagaturini also was feeling that. So when I was with Prabhupada, I was in the room with Prabhupada in the Hong Kong Hilton. She was outside the door, and she didn't even want to come into Prabhupada's presence. And to some degree, that sounds ununderstandable, but why wouldn't you want to be in Prabhupada's presence? But Prabhupada was Prabhupada. You know, he could be very, very, very strong too. And if you weren't ready for that presence, it was very, very difficult. So anyway, he asked me, how is your wife doing with this? You know, in a very, very personal way, because she had actually sacrificed so much to join the movement. He used to say that she sacrificed 3 things. She was an actress, she was okay, moving upward actress, and she gave that up, and she had gone to Hong Kong on his order, and third, that she had married me, which was, of course, an austerity, but that's a whole nother long story too. But she, it was an arranged marriage, and you know, the first day that we met, we were married. So that's so culturally impossible for someone brought up in the West, but she did it, and after 50 years, we're still married, which is just Prabhupada's mercy in that. So in any case, he very much appreciated her. And so he asked me how my wife was doing. And I said, not very good. She was struggling. So he said, bring her in. Okay. So I brought her in, and then he just brought her in front of him. And he took off a ring from his finger, a gold ring, and gave it to her. And of course, she still has that. But this was a different Prabhupada than Prabhupada just sitting on the Vyasasan, who most of the devotees had that relationship with him, and the defender of the Gaudiya Sampradaya, the singer guru sitting on the Vyasasan, and that was one aspect of Prabhupada. Prabhupada had many aspects. He was a person with so many aspects to him. His presence really helped her. Obviously, he was so. His presence gave us life. Not only us, but definitely us. But his presence was the life of the movement. It was going on his presence. So she melted. I don't remember, if she was more teary. I'm sure she was more teary than I am right now, remembering it. But if she was sitting here next to me, we'd need the towels. I'm sure. And she still has the ring, of course. It's her life. And one time, in the middle of the night, fairly recently, she unconsciously took it off and couldn't find it. And the next morning, it was, and then somehow I found it. So I was the hero. But that ring is, it's the treasure of, what could you have more of a treasure than that? Because it's a gesture. It's a gesture of affection, of the person's affection, deep affection. So the two are mixed together and inseparable. And one time when he was talking, he just gazed out over the whole valley and spoke about the scientists, and that they have the power of their bomb to make all the leaves fall off, destroy the trees too, but make all the leaves fall off. But they're limited in power, and they don't have the power to refresh the tree and bring back its leaves. So he would speak like that, and he would speak about anything. One time, someone would come out with some fruit. His servant was Devananda at that time, and he would come out with some fruit for Prabhupada, and after Prabhupada, just only one or two people sometimes would be sitting there, and he would take some fruit, and then the servant would pass it around for us to take the remnants. So I had heard, I don't know where I heard it, but someone gave me some brilliant advice before I had arrived, that to eat the leftover of Prabhupada, such as an orange peel, was even better than just taking something off of his plate. So when Prabhupada saw that I had just taken the orange peel, there was no orange left, and I ate it, then he just looked at me and said, "It's digestible." It was just so funny, and it was so relaxed. And it was just so Prabhupada, how Prabhupada could be, the most serious acharya, and yet he could be just the most friendly of grandfathers, and just such a nice, such a wonderful person as well. So he was serious he was always serious, but not in a grave way always, although obviously he could be very grave. Another time in Vrindavan, when he was staying upstairs, when I first arrived, he called me upstairs, and one of the first things he said to me is, "Have you heard the tape?" And I said, "No." And then he put on the tape, and it was of a studio recording that they had sent him from Los Angeles. And Vishnujan was singing that Vandehan, and Prabhupada's playing the drum there, the mridanga, and later I found out that accompanying him was, and imitating Prabhupada's beat, was another devotee from San Francisco named Jivananda, who I think lives in Dallas, or he had lived in Dallas years ago. And suddenly, I don't know how to describe it, practically speaking, the sound, he was just playing it from a tape recorder, but it was like the greatest sound surround atmosphere was created by that. And it was so, the spiritual world opened up. It was so sweet, and then we just started dancing. I think there was just two other devotees. I remember Arundhati was up there at that time. And we just started dancing. It was like the whole spiritual world had opened up. It was something, it was wonderful. One other time, I had given class on the Bhagavatam. And I still remember the verse, and it was very odd giving class, Bhagavatam class, knowing that Prabhupada was right upstairs and listening. But somehow or another, I wasn't especially nervous, because I didn't think he was really listening, but he was actually listening. And then at the end of the class, Devananda asked, I remember the content of the class, Devananda asked, because it was about Sukadev's conversion from being an impersonalist to a personalist by the mercy of Vyasadev's teaching in the Bhagavatam. So Devananda asked, was that perhaps Sukadev's personal preference rather than explicitly meaning that personal was higher than impersonal? So of course, asking a question like that, we all ganged up on him, and everyone answered him and let him have it. And I gave my part too. I probably said something like, if you're an impersonalist, how could you have a personal preference, or something like that? But then right after the class, I went up to see Prabhupada in his room, and he said, "So they put the question to you, didn't they?" And I said, "Yes." And he laughed. And then Arundhati asked the question, why do impersonalists fall down? Why is it necessary that they fall down? Which was part of someone's answer, because that's what we had heard after all, it was 1968, so our depth of understanding wasn't so great. So she asked in a very sincere way, why do they fall down? Why do they always fall down? No, she asked, do impersonalists always fall down? And Prabhupada said yes. And then she asked, why? And Prabhupada thought for a while. And it was like he was thinking, how can I explain this to these children? That's my later thought on it. He didn't give a philosophical answer. He was thinking, how can I explain it so they'd really understand it in a deep way? And then he thought for a while, and I don't know if I'm imagining he went like this, as he sometimes did, and then he answered in such a simple way, because they get lonely. And there's a volume of philosophical import to that the nature of the soul is active, and we see it everywhere in the world, with every soul, from the birds to the dogs to the monkeys. Everyone gets lonely. And what will fill our loneliness is, of course, Prabhupada was saying, was Krishna. And if we don't have that, even if we rise to the impersonal Brahman, the existential loneliness emptiness that plagues everyone's heart just won't go until we have that relationship with Krishna developed. So there was a lot in that simple, he gets lonely. So Prabhupada was sitting in his upstairs room, and sometimes in the afternoons, devotees would come. Maybe this was in the morning, I don't remember exactly. But he was so relaxed again, and he was so peaceful inside and happy. And he said to the 4 or 5 devotees who were sitting there that the secret of Krishna consciousness is to arrange your life in such a way that you cannot forget Krishna for a moment. And then, and when you read Prabhupada's books, that's really the secret of Krishna consciousness. And Mahaprabhu said, Kirtaniya Siddha Hari. And And Prabhupada himself was always engaged, and it's just so hard to do if you're not a pure soul. This is my realization and reflection on it. You can make an intellectual adjustment and say, from now on, I'm only going to think about Krishna or like that. But when you're a conditioned soul, you just can't do it. You can't do it by intelligence. You have to do it by, if you have love for Krishna, it's natural. Premandana Charita Bhakti Vilochena. But, so he said it like this, but Prabhupada said it in a very practical way. He said, arrange your life in such a way. In other words, let your life be involved in Krishna's service. Everything should be somehow or another connected to Krishna, not have the duality of this is for Krishna and this is not for Krishna in your life. So it calls for depth of consciousness again. So after saying that, the secret of Krishna consciousness is to arrange your life in such a way that you cannot forget Krishna for a moment. Then he turned to Brahmananda Prabhu and he said, isn't that right, Brahmananda? And Brahmananda said, laughed and said, yes, it's not that hard, because he followed whatever the mood that Prabhupada had. And in fact, Brahmananda, many years later, told me that he said, when Prabhupada wanted someone to say yes, he called me. And when he wanted someone to think independently, he called Tamal Krishna Maharaj. So when Prabhupada had come to Japan in 1969, I was already there. He had sent me there to help Sudama, Prabhu, and Balimadan, and Chintamani. Those were just the three devotees were there, which is quite amazing. He just sent his disciples to these places, with nothing, practically speaking, except faith in his order. Prabhupada had given Sudama some instructions. He said, dress in silk and wear flower garlands, and the people will appreciate it. And also, Sudama had told me that when they were looking at a map, this is before he had left, he was he was a servant to Prabhupada at that time, and he got down on they were looking at a map, and Prabhupada got down on the floor with him and was pointing out Tokyo and things like that. So Prabhupada had so many aspects to him. So in any case, I was there also, and then Prabhupada came very unexpectedly. This was in 1970, probably in the beginning of 70, because I got there at the very end of 1969. And as soon as I saw Prabhupada, without knowing anything, he looked so much older and more grave, and I began to cry immediately just seeing him like that. This was at the airport. And then later we found out the cause of him coming. It was said that there was a conspiracy against him, that people weren't passing his mail to him directly. They had changed became the Acharya of ISKCON rather than the founder, or maybe the founder of ISKCON. And we couldn't understand what was going on. I couldn't understand what was going on. But there was something very, very tense. And Prabhupada was traveling with many of his disciples, leading disciples at that time. He had called them all to Los Angeles, and the mood, as we heard it later, was to extricate him out from a very dangerous situation. And many of them had come to Japan with Prabhupada, and Prabhupada was going to India with all of them. And one of the lessons I saw from this is that Prabhupada turned a very difficult situation where he felt his movement was being threatened and his own position and relationship with the movement was being threatened. He turned it into something positive, which is the perfection of Krishna consciousness, to use everything in Krishna's service, even this most difficult situation. So what Prabhupada did is he was turning this negative situation into opening up the biggest preaching field in the world, which was India. And he was powerful and wanted to do that very much. But it was very difficult for him to get visas, so for all his disciples, of course, he being an Indian citizen didn't need a visa, but everyone else needed visas. So there was always communication by telegram with Jayapataka Maharaj in in Calcutta about have the visas come, have the visas come, have the visas come. And so he turned the negative into the positives, which it's the real art, and art in Krishna consciousness. And one of the amazing things that happened there is there was one young Japanese boy who was interested in Krishna consciousness, but he wasn't exactly Japanese. He was Canadian of Japanese origin. His name was Bruce Enomoto. And he was carrying something from a previous life because he was living outside, a recluse, translating from Japanese into English. And he was just living alone, following all the principles, chanting 16 rounds a day, but he had no inclination to like move into the temple or anything like that. And he had been there chanting like that for months. And when Prabhupada came through, he decided he wanted to bring him to India, to Calcutta, and India with him, along with him, with his party, include him in his party. So he asked him to come. And amazingly, this Bruce, who later became Banu, and then still later Banu Swami, was, he pulled him right out and right into such a prominent position, still translating like anything, like a wildfire, but translating the ancient Vaishnava texts into English. Prabhupada first gave these people sannyas and said by preaching, they'll become purified. And then, while he was still in Japan, there was some conclave or meeting in New Vrindavan, and there they started preaching that Prabhupada was God, and the reason why he's left the United States was because he was dissatisfied and unhappy with that people weren't recognizing his actual position. So it was quite extreme. And because they were sannyasis, and they were the only sannyasis at that time, and so much respect was given to them, there were devotees who were confused, and of course there were devotees who were not confused too. So there was a altercation there. And the devotees such as Rupanuga Prabhu and others, they defeated them. And so all this information was being transferred to Prabhupada in Japan at that time. So at that time, Prabhupada excommunicated them from the movement. You know, that they were seemingly disloyal to him or supposedly disloyal to him, didn't kick them out of the movement. But when they started saying he was God, that was too much across the philosophical boundaries, and he excommunicated them. But then later, but he was always so concerned for them that, and I heard a story later on that he had sent Brahmananda to Pakistan, he sent Gagamuni to Bangladesh, and then some news came to Prabhupada when he was in Bombay, this was months later, that American Hare Krishnas were killed during a Pakistani uprising or something like that. And Prabhupada was in complete anxiety about Brahmananda's safety. So despite him thinking of him as a conspirator, and despite the philosophical topsy-turviness of what they were saying, Prabhupada never internally rejected them at all, but rather was in anxiety about their health and welfare. And that was, of course, very touching. There's a few other stories on different that I've heard indirectly, not were present, when Tamal Krishna Maharaj told me that he had asked Prabhupada. There was one brahmachari in the Bombay ashram who wasn't acting properly, so he wanted to get rid of him. So Prabhupada said, give him another chance, tell him he shouldn't smoke or whatever it was. So, but after a while, it was too much what he was doing. So Prabhupada said, tell him my mercy has run out, and kick him out of the ashram. So Tamal Krishna Maharaj had him leave the ashram. It was an Indian devotee. And then later, Tamal Krishna Maharaj had told me this, that he asked Prabhupada, is it true that your mercy has actually run out for him? And Prabhupada said, no. So, you know, he was the teacher. He was just, another story about, I don't know if you want to include the name, but yes, you should include the name for this one, that Gaga Muni was in charge. He was a sannyasi, and he was distributing books for Prabhupada. And this is in the Calcutta temple. And Prabhupada, so there was a person in charge of the book go down, Prasanatma Prabhu. So Gaga Muni would break open the lock and take whatever books he wanted. So Prasanatma went to Prabhupada and complained and said, how can I be in charge of the book go down? You've put me in charge of it when he just breaks the lock, it does everything he wants, anything he wants. And Prabhupada said, let him do what he wants. He helped me so much in the early days. So it wasn't at all mechanical with Prabhupada. You know, he appreciated so much service. He appreciated so much the service that the devotees did, whether it appeared that he appreciated it or not, but the appreciation was so deep within him, so deep. And I could say for myself, because of whatever little service I did, his tolerance, however much I am here, it's because of that only. Okay, Prabhupada was there for the Vyasa Puja, for his own Vyasa Puja in Tokyo in 1970, and it wasn't performed properly to his satisfaction. So he instructed Tamal Krishna Maharaj how to organize it properly, and he allowed us to do it a second time the next day. So a few things I remember from those instructions was that the senior-most person should offer the arti to Prabhupada. And another thing I remember is the order that Prabhupada had us offer the flowers to him at his lotus feet. And it was sannyasis first, then householders along with their wives, and then brahmacharis. That was the order that he said, and he specifically said householders with their wives. Prabhupada, when we were in Hong Kong, Prabhupada was very strong with us. He wanted the Hong Kong temple to go on. So he was very strong, and he didn't want us to leave, and he insisted that we stay. And he never let on to us that he understood how difficult it was just to be there alone and struggling just alone and struggling in such a materialistic place. He never didn't show us sympathy in that sense externally. But then one day, many years later, I was in Sridham Mayapur listening to a Bhagavatam class, and I heard Subhag Maharaj, who had been with Prabhupada in London, tell this story. And I was just standing in the back just listening, so you could imagine how I felt when I heard this. He told the story of how he was with Prabhupada, and in the room with Prabhupada, and suddenly, as he was with Prabhupada, a tear glided down from Prabhupada's eye, down his cheek. So he asked Prabhupada why he was crying, what caused him that tear to fall. And Subhag Maharaj related Prabhupada's words, and he spoke this in the Bhagavatam class, and I was just listening. He said, I am thinking about my disciples in Hong Kong and how much they are suffering. So, but he never let on to us that he understood how difficult it was. He was very strong with us. But he knew, and his blessings really manifested, thousands and thousands of times over. And I could say in my life, I've considered what my greatest regret is in my life, and it's that I couldn't fulfill his desire and just stay there, no matter how difficult it was. We were just kids, basically. But still, if I could have just pleased Prabhupada and just satisfied his desire, that would have been I would have made him happy. That would have been the benefit. When Prabhupada visited in Hong Kong, we had a big program for him in the Park Hotel in 1972, when he visited in the Park Hotel in 1972. So he, at the end of the program, was almost all Indians. There were a few Chinese folks there, souls in Chinese bodies, but it was almost all Indians. So they gave him garlands and this and that. And then at the end of the class, Prabhupada asked this talk, his welcoming talk. This was the first time he had visited Hong Kong, and he asked, "Are there any questions?" So no one answered. So I stood up and said, "If anyone has any questions, please ask Prabhupada." So one boy, young boy, maybe 10 years old, who was in one of our children's classes, he asked a question. And it was the same question he asked me weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks ago about Krishna, because we used to read to them and tell them stories from the Krishna book. So he asked, who started the forest fire? So when he asked that question, I said, Prabhupada's coming in a few weeks, why don't you ask Prabhupada? And I had completely forgotten about it. So when I asked the contingent of people in the room, in the hall, anyone have any questions, Lalu remembered. And he raised his hand and he asked Prabhupada, out of nowhere, who started the forest fire? So Prabhupada said, who started the forest fire? And then he answered philosophically. He said, no one starts the forest fire. This is the nature of the material world, samsara dhamma nalalita loka. The nature of the material world is, and he began to preach philosophically about there's always the forest fire of material existence, always difficulties one after the next. But it was such a surprising thing that he remembered, which brings up another point. When you're taking care of children, you should be very, very, very careful because they have better memories than you think. And they remember a lot of things that you may not wish them to remember. They remember everything. When Prabhupada came to Hong Kong, I had a habit of wanting to offer him gold, because someone had once told me that gold is good for your health. So of course we were concerned with Prabhupada's health. So a person who was helping Spiritual Sky incense at that time out of Los Angeles, he was the person purchasing the incense sticks from China. They were brought to China, and I was interfacing with him on behalf of Spiritual Sky. So he asked me if he could bring, because they have culture there, so he asked, your teacher is there, should I bring him a gift? So I said, why don't you bring him some gold? So he ended up buying this lady's bracelet out of 18-karat gold that was intricately designed, and it cost, he told me, $250, which was a lot in those days. I don't know what it would be worth now. But so when Prabhupada was there in the Park Hotel in 1972, I introduced Larry Mack, that was his name, to Prabhupada, and told him that he was helping Spiritual Sky. And I said, Prabhupada, he has a gift for you. And Larry Mack pulled out this lady's bracelet made out of 18-karat gold, and he put it on Prabhupada. And later on, when we were on the plane going to Japan, Prabhupada, he said to me that, is this bracelet, he mentioned the bracelet, is it for a lady or for a sannyasi? And I said, Prabhupada, it's for your health. And it cost $250, which was a lot in those days. And he said, oh, and then he accepted it like that. But I gave Prabhupada quite a few pieces of gold. One time I gave him in 1974, like an ID bracelet that said Prabhupada on it. And I think that ended up, it's in the Bhaktivedanta Manor safe, I've heard. And one time I gave Prabhupada, this year in 1972, I gave him a 24-karat gold ring that said Jai ISKCON on it. Because at that time, Prabhupada had disbanded the GBC. There was some difficulty or another. So in my childish naivety, I wanted to encourage Prabhupada. So I gave him a ring that said it was Jai ISKCON on it. And we were kids, but we had some sincerity. So that ended up as after Prabhupada's departure, Tamal Krishna Maharaj gave that to Rameshwar Prabhu. So Rameshwar, I understand, still has that. I would love to have darshan of that ring. And then one other ring I gave to Prabhupada, and it just had a P on it. In 1974, it was soft gold. And then years later, I saw Prabhupada still had that ring. So I said, Prabhupada, you still have that ring? And he said, yes, it is a good ring. And later on, he ended up giving it to someone and said, I'm not attached. But that ring, that with the P on it, I traveled and I sat next to Prabhupada on the plane for some of the trip to Japan. And then when we were in Japan, Prabhupada had this soft gold, 24-karat gold ring, and he would move it from finger to finger. And Sudama was massaging him at that time. He was putting mustard oil on Prabhupada's body. He was massaging him. And it was just that myself, Sudama, and Prabhupada were sitting there. So Sudama saw the ring. And he said to Prabhupada, oh, Prabhupada, I see you have a new ring. Prabhupada, yes. He said, who gave it to you? And then Prabhupada just looked at me and turned back and said, oh, someone. So, I mean, it was so subtle. It was so intimate. He just turned something. He could have said, oh, Bhurijana gave that to me, and then, I would have like that. But he just made it just so personal and intimate, and in that way, it was like a secret that he and I shared. It was so sweet. One morning in Hong Kong, I guess it was 1972, we went on a morning walk to Kowloon Park, which is the park near the Chimchatsui area, near where our temple apartment was, and I had knew something about Chinese history, or why China was so prone towards communism and atheism. And one of the reasons was one of the big companies in Hong Kong, Jardine Matheson, the missionaries would ship their Bibles, and the next crates would be the opium that they would sell to the Chinese people. So, and because the way that the history went, the Chinese were very satisfied then, and they didn't have any need to buy the British goods or purchase things from, so they decided to create a market. So they started selling them opium like they did in India with the tea. Obviously heartless. So I said to Prabhupada that the Chinese aversion to religion, and I explained something like this, why they are averse to religion. And Prabhupada replied, they don't know anything about religion. So he clearly drew a distinction between this so-called religious things done in the name of religion and true religion, which means following the words of the Supreme Lord and Prema Pamakto Mahan to learn to love Krishna. So, and the pure practices of Krishna consciousness. So rather than saying, oh, now I understand why they don't like religion, he said they don't actually understand religion. So that was very telling. I think the point that Prabhupada was making was that the material world is a very difficult place, and even in an opulent place like Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is and was very, very opulent compared to a poverty-stricken place, still there's so much problems, and there's still poverty. People who have the karma to be poverty-stricken are poverty-stricken even in the most opulent circumstance. And Prabhupada made that point about seeing the derelicts in the Bowery as well, that he was surprised, to see in the midst of all the opulence, there were people who had the karma for suffering. So one can't avoid one's karma. So, and Prabhupada would make the point that instead of trying to avoid your karma, better to learn how to use your human life to love Krishna. In 1974, when Prabhupada was staying in the Hong Kong Hilton, in the same suite where the Shah of Iran had stayed, one thing is he appreciated that we got him that. He told Satsut Maharaj, and Satsut Maharaj, who was his secretary, passed it on to me, that in Prabhupada's indirect way, he said, whoever has arranged this. It is a great credit for him. So in this Hong Kong Hilton, and it was also very interesting that, you know, the rooms were so big and opulent, and in Prabhupada's sleeping room there was a bed, and he asked me to come in and make the bed for him before he was going to take rest. And he was so little compared to this big bed. It seemed so funny in one sense, but he just accepted it. And we held a press conference for Prabhupada. And at that time, Guru Maharajji was quite prominent, and he had quite a following in Hong Kong, as well as obviously in the United States and Europe. So the reporters, and many reporters came. It was quite full, and they asked him questions. The first question they asked him was, "You preach against materialism and just the acquirement of wealth, etc. But here you are living in this very posh penthouse where the Shah of Iran," they didn't say that, and it was the best place in the Hong Kong Hilton. And he, why are you doing this? He was trying to point out the hypocrisy, that there was hypocrisy in Prabhupada was doing. And Prabhupada his consciousness was so clear. There wasn't any fog at all in Prabhupada's consciousness, and he was never intimidated by any kind of question, direct or whatever, trying to catch him. So he said, as far as I'm concerned, first Prabhupada started explaining philosophically that everything belongs to Krishna, and therefore renunciation means to use everything in Krishna's service. So you can imagine the reporter being completely blank when that one was presented to him. And then Prabhupada decided on a different tack to explain it to him. And he said, for me, as far as I'm concerned, I can live under a tree. And practically speaking, Prabhupada did that in 1977. When he was living in Bhuvaneshwar, he was bathing with out of a well in the mornings in the Kumbh Melas. He didn't have that kind of attachment to opulence. But as far as I'm concerned, Prabhupada said, I could live under a tree. But if I was living under a tree and invited you all to a press conference, would you have come? Complete silence. The point was made, and it was obvious, and it was obvious to them too. So it was such a wonderful answer. Who could have thought of such an answer like that? And then one reporter asked about Guru Maharajji, because reporters naturally like to report on controversy. That makes the news: controversy, negative talking, and etc. And especially if one big spiritual leader is criticizing another big spiritual leader, that's great headlines. So he asked, what do you think about Guru Maharajji? And Prabhupada declined to answer. And he said, no, just ask about Krishna consciousness. We don't know anything about this. And then the reporter asked again. And Prabhupada, for a second time, declined to answer. And then the reporter was quite insistent, and he asked a third time. And for some reason, Prabhupada decided to answer him. And he decided to answer him in a very straightforward, Prabhupada strong way. And he said, he's a cheater and a dog. He says he's God, he's a cheater and a dog. But Krishna is the biggest cheater, and he will be cheated by Krishna. So the reporters were so happy, because this is just the kind of controversies that make headlines. So it made the Hong Kong Standard the next day, trouble in paradise, I think they called it. One guru of Hare Krishna movement calls this Guru Maharajji Guru a dog, something like that. They loved it. And it even made it into Time magazine too. And the next day, some local Indian leaders came to Prabhupada to complain to Prabhupada about what he had said. And Prabhupada just first I interrupted, we sort of want to defend Prabhupada for from these things. And then Prabhupada just said, be quiet, basically, and just watch how I handle it. He didn't say that explicitly, but watch how I deal with it. So I listened very carefully to what Prabhupada said, and he explained to them that we don't have any business criticizing people, but when someone says they're God and without power and people are believing him, that's so foolish. And he doesn't even question himself. I get a toothache, because Prabhupada had somehow followed some news on this, and then he has to go to the hospital to cure the pain from his toothache, and he doesn't question himself, how could I be God if I have to go to the hospital for a toothache? So Prabhupada very patiently and calmly explained to them why he had said that, and they were convinced by the end. And it was wonderful. And then later on, of course, the Guru Maharajis responded in the newspaper, their own side of things and how Prabhupada was wrong for criticizing and everything like that. And then I responded to their letter to what they had written, letter to the editor, and I sent that to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada liked it so much that he read it. He was in Calcutta at that time, because I'd listened to what he said, basically, and I used the argument that lawyers, you may have your opinion, I may have my opinion, but the lawyers in the law court, they argue based on the law. So it's based on Shastra and this and that. So Prabhupada appreciated it, and he distributed it actually to others. So in the Philippines, there was martial law. This was in 1972. Prabhupada had called us to go to the Philippines because there was a good temple there started by Sudama Vipa Swami. And Prabhupada later in the Nectar of Devotion lectures in 1972, he praised that temple very much. In 6 months, he has done so much. And so it was martial law at that time. Marcos had declared martial law, and having big meetings was illegal. But we were in the Makati or Manila Intercontinental, so we decided, or Sudama decided, to hold the meeting anyway. So it was well attended because there were mostly Indians. There was a large Indian congregation, there was Indians in Manila. So there was a full hall, opulent, best hotel in the Philippines and in Manila. So Prabhupada gave his lecture, and it was maybe 500 people there, and after he asked for questions. So the one response stayed in my mind was incredible. So this one person stands up in front of the microphone, and he begins to speak, not asking a question, but just rambling on his own philosophy, just going on and on and on. He was relishing that sweet taste of holding the microphone. And he just kept going on and on. So Prabhupada patiently listened to him for a while, and then he said, "Are you finished yet?" And the person said, "No, I'm not finished." And this story really shows Prabhupada's expertise. So Prabhupada let him go on, and he kept on speaking and speaking and speaking and speaking. And for us who were listening, it felt like he was going on for hours. I don't know how long he was really going on for. And then after a while, maybe several minutes, Prabhupada said, "Are you finished yet?" And the man said, "No." And Prabhupada just patiently sat there and let him go on and on further. And then after a little bit longer, Prabhupada said, "Are you finished yet?" And the man said, "Yes." And then Prabhupada thundered into the microphone, "Then sit down." He had gotten the audience completely on his side, and everyone, the devotees, everyone cheered and clapped after that. He was just so expert. Just myself and Jagatarini was sitting in, I think it's called the Blue Room, where you sit before an event begins. in a theater room called, I think it's the Blue Room, Green Room. It was the Green Room. And Prabhupada knew the name of it was the Green Room, and like Trini, being an actress before, knew it was the Green Room, and they talked about that a little bit. And then Prabhupada picked up, there was just some little trinket that was there with a flag on it made out of wood, and he picked it up, and because we were waiting till everyone had filed in, and it fell apart, and he just laughed and just said, didn't say anything, but you could see he was just saying, just see the nature of the material world that falls apart right before your eyes. You touch it and it falls apart. You think you're going to play with it, and then boom. But then he said something that was so significant, proved significant for me, and I always want to pass this on to anyone who follows Prabhupada, who would like to do some service for Prabhupada. And then he said, it is my desire that Krishna consciousness be spread throughout the universe. You please help me with this, fulfill this desire. So when I think of this, I think of, first of all, he didn't even say the world. He said the universe. And then I thought that Prabhupada's desire, this is my reflections, Prabhupada's desire was so big and so compassionate, based on the depth of his realization, not on some fanaticism or anything like that, but his realization was complete. But it gave a scope for anyone who wants to do any service to please Prabhupada, because the universe is so big. It extends from the person next door to you to making videos about Prabhupada. There's just so much scope for this, to fulfill this desire of Prabhupada. So everyone can find some place to find some service to do and to fulfill Prabhupada's desire to spread Krishna consciousness throughout the universe. In 1972, when Srila Prabhupada came to Tokyo, Sudama, who was in charge, he arranged a program for Prabhupada in Kobe. Kobe had a large Indian community at that time, and there was talk of them possibly donating a temple for us, some land or something for the temple. So we went down there, and Prabhupada was very humble on the way down. He had put his feet up on the chair in front of him where Banu had been sitting, and the conductor and Banu was standing up. So the conductor came by, because it's the Shinkansen, the bullet train that goes so fast. And the conductor said, you can't stand to Banu, so he had to sit down. So I was in the awkward position of having to ask Prabhupada to move his feet. And so Banu could sit down. So I said to Prabhupada, the conductor says that Banu has to sit down. Could you move your lotus feet? And Prabhupada said, so the lotus-like devotee can sit down. So it was very sweet. And then when we got there, there was this program arranged, and somehow or another, there was a program arranged for the Hindu community there and there were quite a few hundred people, all families. But on the same program, a Mayavadi was speaking. So since they were mostly Sindhis, they have the Punjabi habit of reading from the Guru Granth Sahib. They had a hall that was their hall, and whoever reads from the book, which is the basic Sikh book, sits on this asana. So we told the man in charge, we suggested to him that Prabhupada should sit on this asana. And he said, no, this is for who reads the Guru Granth. And we said, no, Prabhupada is so famous, let him sit there. So he agreed. So the Mayavadi sannyasi came in, and we had asked the head of the Hindu Association to give us money for a garland, a nice garland for Prabhupada. So he said, yes, you can have money for the garland for Prabhupada, but you also have to make a garland for the Mayavadi sannyasi too. So we said yes. And we ended up making one big garland for Prabhupada, and we gave the Mayavadi sannyasi Prabhupada's prasadam garland from the day before. And of course, the etiquette is he had to accept it, so he just went like this. So when it came time for Prabhupada to speak, we invited Prabhupada to sit on the asana, and with the Guru Granth, which was a Vyasasana, with Prabhupada sitting on it. And then Prabhupada began to speak. First he had us recite verses from the Bhagavatam, and Prabhupada spoke in English, and he had us lead kirtan, and Prabhupada spoke in English, and he spoke for perhaps a half hour or 40 minutes, and of course, what would Prabhupada speak about? He spoke against Mayavadi philosophy. And then when it was the time for Prabhupada had ended his talk, so it came time for the Mayavadi to speak. So the head of the Hindu society brought the Mayavadi over, and Prabhupada was still sitting on the Vyasasana, and he put up his hand to help Prabhupada get down from the Vyasasana, and so that the Mayavadi could sit there. He was dressed in saffron, big beard, and Prabhupada refused to get down from the Vyasasana. He wouldn't get down. He just didn't acknowledge that he was supposed to get down. So what could they do? And the Mayavadi, of course, was Shanti, Shanti. So he just sat down in his seat, and they brought the microphone over there. So he began speaking in Hindi, and we couldn't understand. There was about 6 or 8 of us there, and we couldn't understand what he was saying, but Prabhupada just sat very gravely on the Vyasasana, and he chanted, and he was just sort of rocking back and forth, chanting on his beads. And we just imitated Prabhupada, so we just sat there in front of Prabhupada, and we rocked back and forth and chanted on our beads. So the Mayavadi spoke for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, all in Hindi, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and Prabhupada the whole time was just chanting on his beads. And then suddenly, after about a half hour, Prabhupada turns to us. He actually looked directly at me and said, "Stop him." He turned to us. And the Mayavadi was speaking, strongly, and he was fired up, and Prabhupada just looked at us and said, "Stop him." And we didn't know what in the world to do. So then Prabhupada said, "Start kirtan." So in the middle of his lecture, we jumped up and started playing kartals and chanting, jumping up and down and chanting. And we had no idea what was going on because the Mayavadi had been speaking in Hindi. So after the Mayavadi ended his speech, Prabhupada got down from the Vyasasana, and Banu was acting as his servant, so he took him back to the apartment where he was staying. And we stayed around to distribute some books. And then we had no idea what had happened, why Prabhupada had tolerated his speaking or listened to his speaking for a half hour, and then suddenly said, "Stop him." So when we finally got back to Prabhupada's apartment, Prabhupada was sitting behind a low desk, and Banu had brought him his hot milk for the night. And then there was a desk lamp, and it was this low light. It was just so dramatic. And we still didn't know what had happened. So we came in and offered our obeisances, and we asked Prabhupada what had happened. And Prabhupada said, first he was speaking all right, but then he started explaining Panchupasana, which means 5 different gradations of demigod worship: Ganesh, Durga, Shiva, Lakshmi Devi, Shiva, and Vishnu. So he started explaining that, Prabhupada said. And then he said, above Vishnu, there is Brahman. And when he said that, this is Prabhupada speaking, and when he said that, I could not tolerate it. It wasn't even like a fanatical thing or a philosophical thing. He just said I couldn't tolerate it, and the way he said it, it just reminded us of Siddhanta Vrndavan. His Guru Maharaj was opposed to anything against the Siddhanta. It was so was unique, and it was heartfelt, and it was like it was the actions of a lover, not a philosopher. It was so unique like that. And then Prabhupada, and he looked so satisfied. He wasn't in anxiety, he wasn't angry, he was just sitting there. And the only way I could describe it was after a cat has caught a mouse. He was almost like purring. He was so happy. And then he said, I am like a lion when I'm out and like a lamb at home. And that's what happened there. There was a controversy, this was in 1972, I presume, where going on in ISKCON whether one could wear non-devotee clothes and distribute books. And some devotees felt strongly it wouldn't work, that it was going to hurt the devotee's consciousness. And some devotees felt, well, more books are going to be distributed. So Karanda Prabhu had come from Los Angeles, and he was strongly in favor of allowing the devotees to wear non-devotee clothes to distribute books. And he showed the facts and figures, how it would hurt the book distribution. I can't honestly say whether his facts and figures were accurate or not, but he was a very strong presenter also. And so he was presenting that to Prabhupada. And somehow or another, this was on a morning walk, and I somehow chimed in. The topic was money. So I said, we're not interested in money. And Prabhupada didn't appreciate my comment at all. And he said, this is hippie philosophy. Without money, how can we spread Krishna consciousness? In defense of myself, I was thinking, we're not interested in money separated from Krishna, but I have to admit there was something in my nature that caused me to chime in that way. And Prabhupada chastised me in that way. Those morning walks were really interesting too. In the beginning, all the devotees wanted to come. And there was, maybe there was 10, 15 devotees. And one of the morning walks, one devotee brought a big tape recorder, a ghetto blaster type of tape recorder. And as Prabhupada started walking down the road, and all the devotees were with him, and he started playing Govindam Adi Purusham as Prabhupada was walking on the tape recorder. And Prabhupada just took a few steps and stopped. And he said, he turned and let the devotees surround him. And he said, there's an old Bengali saying that you eat alone, study in twos, and walk in threes. And then he just turned around and kept walking. And that was the last walk where everyone came. You know, no one had to say don't come, but people allowed Prabhupada his privacy after that. But I went every day, and it was something so mystical and transcendental, just to be walking with Prabhupada. Sometimes Prabhupada wouldn't speak at all, and just Shyamasundar and myself were walking, and you could just hear the sound of his cane, and just listening to the sound of his cane was so exquisite and beautiful as he walked along. And sometimes on recordings you can actually hear the sound of Prabhupada's cane, and it was very special. So on one morning walk, this again was 72 and out of the Tokyo temple. At this time, the Tokyo temple was in Asakawa-cho. It was far away from the city, and it was the place we would take our walk was like a road carved into the mountain, and I had a doubt always about evolution. Because of my training and conditioning, I couldn't quite internally really accept that evolution wasn't real. And then while we were walking, Prabhupada, he just pointed to the trees on the side of the road. And he said, what's the cause of this, that they're all facing the sun? Or what do evolutionists say is the basic principle of evolution? So I said, change. That there's always change, and then randomly, I didn't explain it, and then he responded, chance. I thought he said chance, but I said change, and then he said, change, yes, change. And if things were organized by chance, and then he pointed to all these trees, you would expect at least one tree not to be facing the sun. But look at them, every single one of them, and there was such a long line of trees, and every one of them was facing the sun. So it was a very simple example, but at that time, somehow or another, just by his explanation, I became completely convinced that evolution wasn't a fact. And to this day, I'm even more convinced that evolution isn't a fact. It's, I've thought about it, I've studied it a bit, and I see that it's statistically impossible, actually. So that was Prabhupada's potency. We were walking along on the morning walks, and it was myself and Swamasunda along with Srila Prabhupada, and suddenly a six-legged creature walked across. It looked like a crab. And Prabhupada pointed his cane at it and said, "Be careful, it's a scorpion." So then Swamasunda turned to me and said, "It's a land crab." And so that brings up the question of, was it a land crab? Was it a crab? Was it a scorpion? Prabhupada said it was a scorpion, but what was it really? So the question that's interesting is, what is the perfection of the spiritual master? Is he a zoologist? Is he, what is his perfection? So can he make a mistake on that level? So it's a very interesting question. Because sometimes you hear Prabhupada recite Bhagavad Gita verses that don't exist in the Bhagavad Gita exactly the way Krishna said them. So how is one supposed to see that? So there's an interesting conversation between Prabhupada and disciples. I think it took place in Mayapur, and Satsvarup Maharaj is there, and Jayadvaita Maharaj is asking the question about the perfection of the spiritual master. Does he know everything? So Prabhupada's answer on that walk was that he knows everything. Basically, he knows everything that only Krishna knows everything. But he knows everything that he knows Krishna, and therefore he knows everything because he sees everything in relationship with Krishna. And he said the spiritual master is not God, he says in that walk. So that answered that question in my mind, because I thought about it a lot after that little incident. Interesting little anecdote, that I was sitting with Trivikram Maharaj, who was there, he was serving in Japan, and outside of Prabhupada's room, and Prabhupada rang the bell. So we both went into his room. And before that, Trivikrama was showing me a Bible tract that his brother, who was a born-again Christian, had sent him. So Trivikrama Maharaj showed it to Prabhupada. And the Bible tract said, as many Westerners or Christians are turning to Eastern religions and Hinduism, here is one Hindu PhD who's turning to Christianity. So Prabhupada's looking at it, and the tract, as Trivikram Maharaj had shown me before, explains that he presented, the PhD Christian presented the two strong objections to Hinduism, so-called Hinduism. One was the caste system, and the other was deity worship, the worship of idols. So Prabhupada just looked at it, and he just laughed. And he said he's a PhD but doesn't know anything. And then he revealed to us the reason why he had rang the bell and called us in. He had received some photos of Rukmini Dwarkadish from Karanda, who had come from Los Angeles. And he pulled out a photo of Rukmini Dwarkadish and showed us, and he said, anyway, our God is the nicest God. So he had called us in actually just to show us the photographs of Rukmini Dwarkadish and share their beauty with us. In 1974, I moved to Australia because Jagtarini, my wife, was Australian. And we left Hong Kong and moved to Australia. And after a while, I started a business. And I was feeling bad that I had left Prabhupada's service and I wasn't getting along very well with the temple devotees. And but I used to think of Prabhupada as the boss of the business. He was the owner of the business, and I was working for him. So I would just take what I needed from the business to pay the rent, etc. And I'd send money to Prabhupada every week, every single week. And that sort of made my whole week and my whole life, practically speaking, at that time. So every week I would go to the post office and get a money order, and all I could afford at that time was 25 Australian dollars. But every week I would get a money order and for $25, and I'd send it to Prabhupada, and I'd write a letter. And it would be, the mood of the letter was, please accept this until I could do some service. And then, and every week Prabhupada would reply to my letter and thank me for my donation. And he was very kind and encouraging. And one time I wrote a letter, and gradually I was trying to increase it. So then it was up to $50 a week, and then $100 a week, something like that. So, and I'd write to Prabhupada, please accept this until I can do some service. So he wrote back in one letter, what do you mean? Until you could do some service, you are sending checks. Checks are service. Checks are the best service. That's what he said. He was obviously encouraging me like that. And finally I was able, when he came to Australia for the last time, I was able to give him $1,000 or something like that. And that was very satisfying for me. There's a tendency when you're doing business and you do want to serve, is sort of to want to wait till you have a lot of money, and then you'll be able to give that money or give part of it. But what I learned, I tried to do that in the beginning, and to wait till I had a lot of money, and I didn't end up with a lot of money. So what I concluded was that anytime money passes through your hand, anytime, if you're a householder, anytime money passes through your hand, you should give something to Krishna. Don't wait till you have a lot and say that, then I'll give something. But anytime money passes through your hand, you should give something to Krishna. I'd like to just mention two little stories about Prabhupada and cold. One, when we were in Asakawa-cho in 1972 outside of Tokyo, it's hard to describe what it was like in those days, except that the windows were all made of paper. That was old Japanese style. So the windows are all paper, and in Mangal Arti, and Prabhupada was sitting on the Vyasasan, and you'd be chanting, and the cold smoke would be coming, your breath would be congealing, and cold smoke would be coming out of your mouth while you're singing Samsara Dara. So I was standing in front of Prabhupada in the Vyasasan at some point, and I had a thin shutter on, and of course there was no hot water, and there was no heating. So I was standing in front of him with this thin shutter on, and I was shivering basically. And he looked at me and said, "It is so cold, is it not?" And because sometimes we tend to think of Prabhupada as sort of like a mechanical, pure devotee that has no material experience or something like that. But to me, and that's glorious, you could say, but to me, the fact that he did experience the cold and didn't like it at all, and he didn't like traveling, you could say, as such an elderly man, but the fact that he did it anyway, and he didn't let the fact that it was cold stop him from going to a place like Asakawa-cho in Tokyo to encourage Sudama and the other devotees. he was so dutiful and so devoted to the preaching movement and helping his disciples. So the fact that he experienced the cold and didn't like it, to me, that was more touching than thinking of him in the other way, that I'm with Krishna and I don't experience anything of this world. And a second little story about cold took place in 1974 when we took Prabhupada on a morning walk to the peak, which is on Hong Kong Island in Hong Kong, in the island part of Hong Kong. And we would take him on morning walks there every day. So it was overcast on one particular day, and it was cold, and because it's a peak, it's a small mountain, so the wind was blowing and everything like that, and Prabhupada was wearing a thin coat. So I asked Prabhupada, if it's cold, Prabhupada, would you like to go back? And he said no. And then, if I remember correctly, I said, maybe he asked me, but are you cold? And I said yes. And I was thinking that, because I knew he must be cold. But I said yes, and I was cold too. And then he said, oh, immediately we should go back. So I saw, it gave me a glimpse into Prabhupada's heart. For himself, he was ready to sacrifice any inconvenience, but when it came to inconveniencing his foolish disciple, me, then Prabhupada, he immediately didn't want to inconvenience me. So that was a glimpse into the heart of a true transcendental gentleman. When Prabhupada was in Hong Kong in 1974, when we were walking on the peak, he turned to me and said that he wanted at least one Chinese devotee to become initiated in Mayapur. So we ended up bringing several to Mayapur. And it was a unique thing because Raymond, who Prabhupada had met, he was a young man, but he was a gentleman, and he was working in the electrical company. He was an engineer. And I told Prabhupada, I have one Chinese gentleman to meet you, that I wanted him to meet you. So this was in Hong Kong in 1974, so I brought Yasomati Sutta in, and he told Prabhupada that Chinese people are very attached. First thing he said actually was that Prabhupada looked at him, and he was young. He was just 2 years older than me, and I was 20-something. So Prabhupada said, where is the gentleman? But then when he started dealing with him, he started recognizing that he was a gentleman. So the first thing Yasomati Sutta said to Prabhupada, his name was Raymond then, Young Pakhe. So he said to Prabhupada that Chinese people are very attached to their families. So I expected Prabhupada to say, that's okay, you can be attached to your family and chant Hare Krishna or whatever. But Prabhupada just looked at him and said, that's natural. Even dogs and birds are attached to their families. So, and he was able to take it, and he ended up coming to Mayapur, and he couldn't get a visa, but somehow or another we got into the country anyway. And on Gopurnima in 1974, he became initiated. And Young Pakhe received the name of Yasomati Sutta. And Prabhupada commented, this boy is so nice that the whole race of China has become glorified because of him. Just like if there is one sandalwood tree in a forest, the whole forest becomes fragrant. And it was so, this one came by Prabhupada's mercy directly. And he even wrote me a letter one time when we were struggling, saying the people aren't interested. He said, there is one there, meaning there's one there that Krishna will send, and this was the one. And when he became initiated, we immediately asked him to translate the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita, start him translating into the Chinese language, into Chinese characters. So after he had done some, we went into Prabhupada's room in Mayapur, and And I told him that Yasomati Sutta had translated this, and would he like to hear it? So there was a wood carving of Radha and Krishna, which is still there in Prabhupada's room in Mayapur. And it was made in Indonesia by Amoga Prabhu, had it carved for Prabhupada and brought for Prabhupada. So Prabhupada had Yasomati Sutta read this to the wood carving, to Radha and Krishna. And Prabhupada, after he heard some, Prabhupada commented, "It is so sweet, is it not?" And then he turned to the life members who were in the room, some aristocratic life members from Calcutta, and said, in Bengal, they're trying to turn others into communists, but we are going to China and turning the communists into Vaishnavas. And Prabhupada was so pleased with that. When Prabhupada came to Melbourne in 1975, at the airport, there was a press conference, and the reporters were quite aggressive. So the first one, after asking Prabhupada what the tilak is and all the superficial questions, asked him what the AC stood for in his name. And Prabhupada said, "You won't understand." And he said, "No, please tell me what the AC stands for in your name. You won't understand. No, please tell me." And then Prabhupada said, "Abhaychana Arvindam." But he said it so fast that even I couldn't understand it. And then he said, the reporter replied, "What did you say?" And Prabhupada said, "I told you wouldn't understand." He just couldn't be defeated in any way. And then another aggressive reporter, looking to show Prabhupada as an exploiter of these poor innocent cult members, he said to Prabhupada, "I've heard that your disciples, they only sleep 6 hours a night," because the obvious was to point to he's exploiting them and there's someone on top that's enjoying on behalf of all their hard work. So I heard that your disciples only sleep 6 hours a night. And then in a very pointed, one would have to say nasty way, considering Prabhupada was such a gentleman and so senior in age and everything, he said, "How many hours a night do you sleep?" And Prabhupada answered, "I go to sleep at 10 o'clock and wake up at 12 o'clock. And then Madhavisa Swami, who was taking care of Prabhupada, who was the GBC there and had such an intimate relationship with Prabhupada, he immediately interrupted and said, "Prabhupada he sleeps less than his disciples. He sleeps only 4 hours a night." And Prabhupada said, No. I go to sleep at 10 o'clock and wake up at 12 o'clock, indicating it was only 2 hours a night. So that was something very special. In Melbourne, they had a wonderful Tulsi garden. And the gardener, the Tulsi gardener, he was somewhat eccentric, but he was obviously had devotion, and the Tulsi garden was blossoming, and it was wonderful and well cared for. But yet he was somewhat eccentric. So while I was in the room, and Madhavisa Maharaj was there with this Tulsi gardener, with Srila Prabhupada, he had a question that he wanted to ask Prabhupada, and the question the gardener wanted to ask Prabhupada was how many Tulsi leaves was required to place on the plate to make an offering. And you could see, because Tulsi gardening was his whole life, that he was imagining the whole plate would be covered by thousands and thousands of Tulsi plants, or Tulsi manjaris and leaves. And then so he asked Prabhupada, in his eccentric accent, he asked Prabhupada, how many Tulsi leaves should we offer on the plate of prasadam? And Prabhupada just looked at him and said, 1. And it was again Prabhupada showing the importance of the devotion that things are made with. In Melbourne in 1975, Prabhupada was speaking to a group of devotees in his house, and the house he was staying in. And I can't exactly remember the topic he was talking about, but what came up was that if you remain celibate between the ages of 16 and 21, Prabhupada said, then your brain becomes so fertile for spiritual realization. So he said that, and when he said so fertile, he emphasized the so, and it was very striking. And then he looked around at the devotees in the room. They were all like this. And then he just laughed and said, but if you chant Hare Krishna, everything will be all right anyway. And then, and another time in that same sequence, he was speaking about book distribution. And some of these, there's a few points that came up, and most of them happened there, but one or two I may have read somewhere and sort of integrated in my mind. So he said that the book he actually imitated, this I saw him do, he imitated a book distributor handing out a book to someone and said, please take this book. And then he imitated the person saying to the book distributor, okay, what's it about? And then he imitated the book distributor saying, I don't know, it's for you. And then he said, my only criticism of the devotees is they think my books are for distribution, not for reading. So he said that, and I saw him say that one. And also, he also said that why are we so interested in book distribution? Because it is distribution of knowledge. And then he repeated it again, because it is distribution of knowledge. So that was something that happened in Melbourne. When Prabhupada was in Hong Kong in 1974, he understood how difficult it was actually preaching there. And while we were sitting I was standing in his room, and he was sitting, I believe, he just turned to me and said, when you have been preaching for 10 years, you can go and live in Vrindavan. And then the conversation ended, or I left, or something like that. And more or less, I forgot about that. And then, as it turned out, when I was writing the book that I had written about Prabhupada called My Glorious Master, I remembered that incident and I put it down in the book. And then I calculated the exact amount of time it was. And when I added up the preaching I had done, and this was in 1983 when I actually started living in Vrindavan, in September in 1983, and I wrote the book basically in 1986. So I started calculating the exact amount of time I preached, including my Gurukul years, and exactly after 10 years and a few months, I ended up living in Vrindavan. So we could see the power of the blessings of Srila Prabhupada and the power of the words of Prabhupada. In Japan in 1972, Prabhupada was lecturing. And the lecture is recorded because once when I was listening to Prabhupada's lectures, I came across that one, and I heard almost all of this little exchange. So at the end of the lecture, or during the lecture, and especially at the end as I remember it, Prabhupada was saying how important it was that we want to go back to Godhead, that's so important, that desire is very strong. So at the end of the lecture, in a very naive, superficial way, I said, we don't want to go to Goloka. I think he said Goloka. We don't want to go to Goloka, Prabhupada. We just want to serve you. But it wasn't truly a deep thought or even a really deep sentiment. It was somewhat childish, because I was somewhat childish. And then Prabhupada just looked at me and said, don't make me come back to accept your service. So he was pushing the point, actually, that 2 points. One was that we should desire to be with Krishna. And the second point was the responsibility that he himself had to to ensure that we do rejoin Krishna in Goloka Vrindavan. But then the part that didn't get recorded, I said to Prabhupada softly, "You're already there, Prabhupada." In 1975 in Melbourne, yes, it was definitely 1975 because we were in the current temple building. And in 1974, when Prabhupada was there, the temple was in St. Kilda Road. So in 1975, Prabhupada was getting massaged by Shrutakirti. And I was the only other person in the room, and Shrutakirti, in his expert way, was massaging Prabhupada. He was in a gamsa, Prabhupada was in a gamsa. It actually had given Prabhupada some sandalwood oil too at that time, or previously, perhaps. But so Shrutakirti was massaging Prabhupada, and Prabhupada was in a reflective mood, and he said that because I let women, move into the temples, because of that, I was successful. And my godbrothers, Prabhupada said, criticized me for this. And then he laughed and said, but their biggest programs are their Navadvip Parikramas, and who comes? It's mostly ladies, widows anyway. So then Shrutakirti Prabhu asked a very intelligent question. He said, Prabhupada, you said that because you made this adjustment, therefore you are successful. But how do you tell the difference between changing a principle and making an adjustment? And Prabhupada thought for some time, and he said, that takes a little intelligence. Yeah, and I thought about this interaction, this exchange for some time, and I understood a few things. One was that making changes it had to be done because time forces changes. Times change, and that forces the fact that you do have to change things sometimes. But the principles, the essential principles, the foundational principles, they shouldn't be changed. They can't be changed, otherwise everything is lost. So Prabhupada, his point was that changes could be made, as I understood it, but it had to be done very carefully. It takes a little intelligence, or a lot of intelligence and deep intelligence to know the difference between something that is adjustable and something that is not adjustable. I think of it in terms of what was Prabhupada's secret. And when the time I spent the most sequential time with Prabhupada, day after day after day, was when I traveled with him from Melbourne in 1976 to Honolulu. That was the last time he visited Fiji, the last time he visited New Zealand, the last time he visited Honolulu, Hawaii also, and the last time he visited Los Angeles directly after that. So being with him for that time, you sort of lost some of your fear in his association because he was such a strong and powerful person. So you sort of got used to his presence to some degree, not in an over-familiar way, but you could relax a bit in his presence. So after I left him in Hawaii, and then went to Los Angeles, and then I went to Dallas. And in Dallas, for the first time, I was asked to do some deity worship on a installed regular altar. And when I walked up on the altar, Radhakalachandji, without any premeditated thought or anything like that, or preconceived idea, the moment I walked onto the altar of Radhakalachandji, I recognized the feeling of being with Radhakalachandji, means Radha and Krishna, and in a Vrindavan mood, is exactly the same feeling as being with Prabhupada. So something really fell into place in my mind at that time, and especially after having lived in Vrindavan for many years, is that was what Prabhupada's secret was, is that he carried Vrindavan with him wherever he went. And that sweetness And that sweetness that is only available in the spiritual world, he was living in that as his reality. I think of it in terms of a bubble, in one sense. Prabhupada carried with him a bubble of sweetness, a bubble of Vrindavan, and he attracted everyone, not everyone, but everyone who entered that bubble was affected by that bubble, and some were extremely attracted. So when I think of Prabhupada as not having left Vrindavan in that sense, but having brought Vrindavan to the world, and we wish to be with him in Vrindavan.
Je anilo premadana koruna prachu